My son, Gregory, a man I once held in my arms and rocked to sleep, told me I was already a corpse. He said it with the casual cruelty of someone flicking a piece of lint off a perfectly tailored suit. He looked at my body, slowed by illness, at my face, made placid by a mask of muscle weakness, and he passed his judgment. I was no longer his mother. I was a piece of inconvenient, dying flesh, a living corpse. He only started to question his diagnosis when he began to hear my breathing in the silent, empty rooms of his house. A soft, persistent, rhythmic sound of life, right behind his shoulder, a ghost of the vitality he had tried so hard to deny. Hi everyone, I'm Grandma Helen. My name is Helen Croft. I am 78 years old, and this is not a story about ghosts. It is a story about breath. It's about how the most fundamental sign of life, the simple, unconscious act of drawing air into your lungs and letting it out again, can become a weapon. It's about how a son who tried to silence his mother's life force only succeeded in amplifying it, turning it into a haunting he could never escape. This is a difficult story to tell. It is a story about the quiet, hidden cruelties that can flourish in the sterile soil of a modern family. It is the secret I have held in the silent spaces of my own heart, a secret that has kept me company in the long, lonely nights. But I have learned that silence can be a poison. It is time to exhale. It is time to let this story breathe. Before I take you into my son's beautiful, silent house, I ask for a moment of your time. Please, like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your presence, your willingness to listen, is a breath of life for me. It affirms my existence in a way I thought I had lost forever. To understand how my son could look at me and see a corpse, you must first understand the woman I was, and the illness that changed me. I was not always a slow, quiet woman. In my youth, and for most of my adult life, I was a dancer. Not a ballerina, but a teacher of ballroom dance. My husband, Robert, was my partner in every sense of the word. We owned a small, successful dance studio. Our life was a whirlwind of music, of movement, of laughter. My body was my instrument, my language. I expressed my joy, my love, my very being, through the grace and energy of a waltz, the passion of a tango. Our son, Gregory, grew up surrounded by this life. He was a serious, watchful child who preferred books to dancing, but he was always there, a quiet observer in the corner of the studio. Robert and I adored him. We gave him a life filled with love, stability, and the constant, joyful rhythm of music. Robert passed away 10 years ago. The music in my life didn't stop completely, but it faded to a quiet, melancholic tune. I continued to teach for a few more years, but the joy was gone. Then, my own body began to betray me. It started with a tremor in my left hand, then a stiffness in my limbs. My movements, once so fluid and precise, became slow, deliberate, and difficult. My face, which had always been so expressive, began to settle into a placid, mask-like stillness. The diagnosis was Parkinson's disease. It is not a disease that kills you quickly. It is a disease that slowly, methodically, steals your ability to express yourself. It locks you inside your own body. Your mind is sharp, your feelings are as vibrant as ever, but the instrument of their expression is broken. I was a dancer trapped in a body that could no longer dance. I was a woman trapped behind a face that could no longer smile. For several years I managed on my own, in the small, comfortable house Robert and I had shared. But the disease progressed. I became a fall risk. Simple tasks, like buttoning a shirt or chopping vegetables, became monumental challenges. Gregory, my successful, important son, who now worked as a high-powered attorney in a city 100 miles away, began to worry. His worry, however, was not the soft, gentle worry of a loving son. It was the sharp, anxious, impatient worry of a man dealing with a logistical problem. "Mom, this isn't sustainable," he'd say during his brief, dutiful monthly visits. He would look around my small, slightly cluttered house with a look of distaste. He was a man who lived in a world of clean lines, of minimalist decor, of perfect, controlled order. My world of comfortable chairs, of sentimental knickknacks, of a life lived and accumulated, was an offense to his aesthetic. "You need proper care," he continued. "You need to be somewhere safe, somewhere I can keep an eye on you." And so the decision was made. I was to move in with him. He had just married a woman named Claire, an interior designer who shared his love for all things minimalist and beige. They lived in a large, silent house that looked more like an art gallery than a home. I did not want to go. My house was my sanctuary. It was filled with memories of Robert, of a life of music and movement. But I was no longer in a position to argue. My son, in his crisp, expensive suit, his voice filled with the unassailable logic of a lawyer making his closing argument, presented the move not as a choice, but as a foregone conclusion. The day I moved into his house was the day I began to truly disappear. My furniture, my beloved comfortable things, were deemed unsuitable. "They just won't work with the aesthetic of the house, Mom," Gregory explained, as if that were a perfectly reasonable thing to say. My belongings were sold, or given away. I was allowed to bring one suitcase of clothes and a small box of personal mementos. My new room was a guest suite on the ground floor. It was a beautiful room, in a cold, sterile way. The walls were white. The furniture was a pale Scandinavian wood. The bed was a low platform that was difficult for me to get into. There were no pictures on the walls. There were no books on the shelves. There was no life in the room. It was a perfect empty box. And in that perfect empty box, I began to die a slow, quiet death of the soul. Gregory and Claire were not overtly cruel. They were, in many ways, worse. They were indifferent. They treated me with a kind of benign neglect that was, in its own way, a profound form of violence. I was a problem that had been solved. I was housed. I was fed. I was safe. My physical needs were being met. My emotional, spiritual, and intellectual needs were completely and utterly ignored. My days were a monotonous, silent loop. I would wake up in my white room. I would slowly, painfully, get dressed. I would sit in the single, hard-backed chair and look out the window at a perfectly manicured, perfectly empty garden. Claire would bring me my meals on a tray. The food was healthy, bland, and joyless. She would place the tray down with a tight, polite smile, ask me if I needed anything, and then leave before I could formulate a response with my slow, clumsy tongue. Gregory was a ghost in my life. He would leave for work before I was up and come home long after I had eaten my solitary dinner. He would sometimes pop his head into my room in the evening, his tie loosened, his face etched with the fatigue of a long day. "Everything okay, Mom?" he'd ask, his eyes already on his phone. I would try to tell him about my day, about the loneliness, about the crushing silence. But the words would come out slowly, slurred. He was an impatient man. He did not have time for my struggle. He would listen for a moment, his face a mask of strained patience, and then he would cut me off. "Great, Mom. Sounds good. Well, I've got to go. Big day tomorrow." And he would be gone. The most painful part was his refusal to see me, to truly see me. He looked at my slow movements, my expressionless face, and he saw not a symptom of a disease, but a symptom of my own decline. He saw senility. He saw a lack of effort. He saw a woman who had given up. He did not see the vibrant, intelligent mind trapped inside. He did not see the dancer who was still alive within me, her heart still beating in waltz time. He saw only the shell, and he began to treat me like one. He started talking to me as if I were a child or a simpleton. His voice would become loud, slow, patronizing. "Now, Mom, did we take our pills today?" he'd ask, his voice dripping with a false, cheerful condescension. He started making decisions for me without consulting me. He canceled my magazine subscriptions, saying, "You don't really read them anymore, do you?" He gave away my small collection of classical music CDs, saying, "You have the television for entertainment." He was slowly, methodically, erasing me. He was stripping away the small things that defined me, that brought me joy, that connected me to the woman I used to be. He was curating my existence, trimming it down to the bare, essential minimum. A body to be fed, a patient to be medicated, a problem to be managed. The final brutal blow, the one that shattered the last remnants of my spirit, came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. It was the day of my annual checkup with my neurologist. Gregory had taken the afternoon off work to drive me, an act that he made clear was a great and burdensome sacrifice. The appointment did not go well. The doctor, a new young man who did not know my history, was concerned about the progression of my disease. He spoke about increasing my medication, about the possibility of needing more advanced care in the future. He spoke about me, to Gregory, as if I were not in the room. Gregory's frustration was a palpable, vibrating thing. He saw not a medical challenge, but a logistical and financial nightmare. He saw his clean, orderly life becoming more complicated, more burdened. The drive home was filled with a tense, angry silence. Gregory's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the rain-streaked landscape, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. When we got home, he helped me out of the car, his movements rough and impatient. As we walked into the house, he finally broke his silence. "This is just, it's too much," he said, his voice a low, furious growl. He wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to himself, to the universe. More medication, more appointments, more care. What's the point? He stopped in the middle of the cold, white living room, and he finally turned to look at me. And the look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated resentment. He saw me, his mother, not as a person suffering from a cruel disease, but as the disease itself, as the source of all his problems. "What is the point of all this, Mom?" he asked, his voice rising, laced with a cruel, rhetorical despair. We're just prolonging the inevitable. We're just keeping a body alive. But you're not really in there anymore, are you?" I stared at him, my heart seizing, the words a physical blow. "I mean, look at you," he continued, his voice dripping with a contempt so profound it was almost a physical force. He gestured at my slow, trembling body, at my still masked face. "You don't talk. You don't smile. You just sit there. You're a shell. A husk. All the life is gone. You're already a corpse. We're just waiting for your body to get the memo." A corpse. He said the word. He looked at his own mother, the woman who had given him life, and he called her a corpse. He had passed his judgment. He had declared me dead. In his mind, I was already gone. All that was left was the tedious, burdensome business of dealing with my remains. I wish I could say I screamed. I wish I could say I raged. I wish I could say I slapped his handsome, cruel face. But my body, my traitorous body, would not obey. All I could do was stand there, my face a placid, frozen mask, and absorb the full, killing force of his words. He saw my lack of reaction not as a symptom of my disease, but as a confirmation of his judgment. He saw my stillness as emptiness. He saw my silence as consent. "You see," he said with a small, bitter, triumphant laugh. "Nothing. It's like I'm talking to a wall." He shook his head, a man utterly convinced of his own tragic, burdensome righteousness. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the silent, white room. I stood there for a long time. The rain beat against the large glass windows. The house was silent, and in that silence, I felt the last, flickering ember of my old self, my old love for him, finally, irrevocably, extinguish. He was right about one thing. The woman he knew as his mother was gone. She had died in that moment, killed by his words. But he was wrong about the most important thing. I was not a corpse. A corpse is an empty vessel. And I was not empty. I was filled. I was filled with a rage so pure, so cold, so absolute. It was a new kind of life force. He wanted a corpse. He wanted me to be a silent, still, empty thing. Fine. I would be the quietest, stillest creature he had ever known. But I would not be empty. I would be present. I would be a presence in his perfect, silent house. I would be a breath in his empty rooms. I would be the one thing a corpse can never be. I would be the air he breathes. And he would learn to fear the silence. He would learn to fear the sound of a life he had tried and failed to extinguish. My son's declaration of my death was, ironically, the beginning of my new life. The life of a ghost. Not a ghost of the dead, but a ghost of the living. A ghost whose only power, whose only weapon, was the very breath he had tried to deny. In the days following his brutal pronouncement, a strange and terrible calm settled over me. The rage did not dissipate. It crystallized. It transformed from a hot, chaotic fire into a cold, focused, diamond-hard point of energy in my chest. I stopped trying to communicate with him, to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. I accepted the role he had assigned me. I became the corpse in the guest room. I moved through the silent white house with a slowness and a stillness that was no longer just a symptom of my disease, but a conscious act of will. I became a master of invisibility. I would sit in my chair for hours, perfectly still, my breathing shallow, my presence so minimal that Gregory and Claire would forget I was even in the room. They would talk around me, about me, their voices filled with the casual cruelty of people discussing an inconvenient piece of furniture. "We need to start looking at long-term facilities," Gregory would say, standing in the kitchen, sipping his expensive espresso. "I can't have my life revolving around her medication schedule forever." "The sooner, the better," Claire would agree, her voice a silken thread of resentment. "Her presence casts such a pall over the house. It's like living in a hospital." I would listen, my face a placid mask, and I would feel my cold, hard core of rage growing denser, heavier. They were planning my disposal, the final act of my erasure. They thought the battle was over. They had no idea it was just beginning. The first manifestation was small, so small that Gregory dismissed it as a trick of his own tired mind. He was a man who prided himself on his logic, his rationality, his control. The world, to him, was a series of explainable phenomena. A ghost, a whisper, a breath from nowhere, had no place in his orderly universe. He was working late in his home office one night, a week after our confrontation. The house was silent. Claire was out at a charity gala. I was in my room, a quiet, forgotten object at the other end of the house. The only sound in his office was the soft click of his keyboard and the gentle hum of his computer. He was reviewing a complex legal brief, his mind sharp and focused. And then he felt it, a slight, almost imperceptible change in the air behind his right shoulder, a subtle drop in temperature, and with it, a sound. Or rather, the impression of a sound. A soft, slow, rhythmic exhalation, so quiet it was more a feeling than an audible event. He stopped typing. He tilted his head, listening. The sound was gone. There was only the hum of the computer. He shook his head, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. The vents, he thought. This old house is full of strange noises. He was a man who found rational explanations for everything. He went back to work. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, it was closer. Clearer. Taut. The distinct, unmistakable sound of a single slow breath, right behind him. It was the sound of a person breathing. A living person. He spun around in his expensive leather chair, his heart giving a sudden, sharp jolt. The room was empty. The door was closed. There was nowhere for anyone to be. He stood up and walked around the room, his lawyer's mind searching for evidence, for a logical source. He checked the air conditioning vent. It was silent. He checked the window. It was sealed shut against the night chill. There was no explanation. He sat back down at his desk, a strange, prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He tried to focus on his work, but his concentration was shattered. The silence of the room, which had once been a comforting symbol of his control, now felt watchful. He had the distinct, unnerving feeling that he was no longer alone. He told himself he was overworked, stressed. The pressure of his job, the added burden of my presence in his home, it was getting to him. He was hearing things. He finished his work quickly, his movements jerky and hurried, and he left the office, flicking the light off with a hand that was not quite steady. That night, he had a dream. He dreamt he was in a vast, empty white room, much like his own house. He was alone, but he could hear a sound. A soft, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He would walk towards the sound, but it would always remain at the same distance. He would cover his ears, but the sound was inside his head. It was the only sound in the empty world of his dream. The sound of a life he could not see. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. The dream, and the memory of the sound in his office, left him with a lingering sense of unease that he could not shake. My haunting of Gregory was a campaign of escalating subtlety. I did not want to frighten him with loud noises or sudden apparitions. That was not my style. I was a dancer, a creature of nuance and control. And I was a woman he had declared a corpse. My revenge, therefore, had to be a thing of life. It had to be intimate, invasive, and undeniable. It had to be my breath. I began to practice. In the long, silent hours in my room, I would focus my will. I would close my eyes and I would breathe. I would imagine my breath, my life force, not as a physical thing, but as an energy, an essence. I would imagine it detaching from my body, a fine, invisible mist of pure vitality, and I would send it out into the house. I learned to control it. I learned to direct it. I learned to make it manifest in the quietest, most unexpected places. It would find him in the shower. He would be standing under the hot, pounding water, his mind on the day ahead, and he would feel a sudden, inexplicable cold spot on the back of his neck, followed by the soft, warm puff of a single breath against his wet skin. He would spin around, his heart lurching, to see nothing but the steam and the tiled walls. It would find him in his car. He would be sitting in traffic, the windows up, the radio off, and he would hear it. A soft, sighing exhalation from the empty passenger seat beside him. He would glance over, his blood running cold, to see nothing but the expensive leather upholstery. It began to wear on him. His perfect, controlled world was being invaded by a phenomenon he could not explain, could not rationalize, could not control. His sleep became fitful, punctuated by the recurring dream of the breathing in the white room. He became irritable, snapping at Claire, at his colleagues at work. He started looking over his shoulder. The silence of his own home, once his sanctuary, was now his torment. It was a canvas against which the sound of my breath was painted in ever clearer strokes. Claire, his wife, was oblivious. She was a woman who lived on the surface of things. She noticed his irritability, his exhaustion, but she attributed it to the stress of his job. She did not hear the breathing. She did not feel the cold spots. The haunting, like my son's cruelty, was a private, intimate affair between the two of us. The first time he acknowledged it out loud was a month after it began. He and Claire were in the kitchen, preparing one of their joyless, healthy meals. I was in the living room, a silent, still figure in my armchair. "Did you hear that?" he asked suddenly, his head cocked. "Hear what, honey?" Claire asked, not looking up from her task of chopping kale. "That sound," he said, his voice low and tense. A sigh. It sounded like it was right behind me. Claire finally looked at him, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Gregory, don't be ridiculous. There's no one here. It was probably just the house settling." She glanced over at me, sitting motionless in my chair. "Unless you think your mother has suddenly learned how to sigh again." The casual, dismissive cruelty of her remark was a small, sharp stab. But it was her husband's reaction that interested me. He looked over at me, a strange, searching, almost fearful expression on his face. He was looking at the corpse in the chair, the silent, still woman who could not possibly be the source of the living, breathing sound that was slowly driving him mad. The cognitive dissonance was a visible torment on his face. "No," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Of course not. It was nothing." But it was not nothing. And he knew it. My campaign escalated. The breath became bolder. It was no longer just a soft, sighing sound. It began to take on a more distinct character. Sometimes it would sound ragged, labored, the sound of a person struggling for air. Other times it would be a deep, slow, peaceful, sleeping breath. And sometimes, most terrifyingly of all, it would be a soft, sad, weeping breath, a sound of profound, inconsolable grief that would find him in the dead of night and leave him with a cold, aching sense of a sorrow that was not his own. He started to lose his grip. His work, the center of his universe, began to suffer. He would lose his concentration in meetings, his head tilting, his eyes darting to the corners of the room, listening for a sound no one else could hear. His colleagues started to whisper. They saw a man who was fraying at the edges, a man who seemed to be haunted by something they could not see. He tried to fight back. He tried to reclaim his silence. He bought a high-end white noise machine for his office, a device that produced a constant, soothing hiss. But it didn't work. The sound of my breath would just weave itself into the static, a rhythmic, living pattern in the electronic noise. He started playing loud classical music in the house, trying to drown out the silence. But in the brief pauses between the notes, he would hear it. A soft, patient, waiting breath. The breaking point, the moment his carefully constructed wall of rationality began to crumble, came on a Saturday. He was home, alone. Claire was at a spa for the day. I was, as always, in my room. He had decided to clean out the garage, a task he approached with his usual ruthless efficiency. He was throwing away old things from his childhood that had been stored in boxes for years. He came across a box labeled, "Gregory, School Days." He opened it. Inside were his old report cards, his school pictures, a collection of essays he had written. He sat on the cold concrete floor of the garage, surrounded by the ghosts of his own past. He picked up a picture of himself from the 5th grade. A serious-looking boy with big, dark eyes. He remembered that day. He remembered how proud I had been. He remembered how I had told him he was the most handsome, smartest boy in the world. And as he sat there, holding the picture, he heard it. The sound was not behind him. It was right next to his ear. A soft, gentle, loving sigh. The sigh of a mother looking at a cherished photograph of her son, Jai. A sigh so filled with love, with memory, with a profound and heartbreaking sadness that it bypassed his ears and went straight to his heart. He dropped the photograph as if it had burned him. He scrambled to his feet, his face ashen. The garage was silent. But the feeling of that sigh, the emotional weight of it, lingered in the air. It was not a sound of terror. It was a sound of love. And for him, in that moment, that was the most terrifying sound of all. He fled the garage, leaving the box of his childhood open on the floor. He went into the house and poured himself a large glass of whiskey, his hands shaking. He drank it down in one go, the fiery liquid doing nothing to burn away the cold dread that was blooming in his chest. He was being haunted. He, Gregory Croft, a man of logic and law, was being haunted. And the ghost was not a stranger. The ghost was his mother. Not her spirit. Not her specter. Her life. Her breath. Her love. He walked to my room. He stood in the doorway, looking at me. I was sitting in my chair, my hands folded in my lap, my face a still, placid mask. The corpse. The empty shell. He looked at me, and I looked at him. Our eyes met. And in his, I saw not anger, not frustration, but a new and unfamiliar emotion. Fear. He was afraid of me. He was afraid of the silent, still woman in the chair. He was afraid of the life that was inside me, a life so powerful, so persistent, that it had detached itself from my broken body and was now following him, breathing down his neck, demanding to be acknowledged. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice a raw, ragged thing. I did not answer. I simply looked at him, and I took a slow, deliberate breath. In one, and out. He flinched as if I had screamed. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of my chest. He saw the life in my eyes. And he heard, in the dead silence of the house, a corresponding sigh right behind his own head. He turned and fled. He ran out of the house, got into his expensive car, and drove away, a man running from a ghost that was already inside him. The aftermath of that moment was a complete unraveling. Gregory's carefully constructed world, his fortress of logic and control, had been breached by a single whispered word and a puff of warm air. The ghost was real, and the ghost was his mother. He did not speak of it to Claire. How could he? How could he explain that his slow, silent, disabled mother was a kind of psychic entity, a poltergeist of breath, who was haunting him for his own cruelty? She would have had him committed, but the haunting stopped. The moment I knew that he knew, the moment I saw the terrified, shattered understanding in his eyes, I called my ghost back. I withdrew my breath from his world. The silence that returned to the house was no longer my silence. It was his. A silence filled with the memory of what he had heard, what he had felt. A silence filled with his own fear, his own guilt. He did not take me to Northwood Gardens senior living. The end of the month came and went. The movers never arrived. The subject was never mentioned again. He began to change. He became quiet, withdrawn, watchful. He started to treat me with a new, strange, fearful reverence. He would bring me my meals himself, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the tray before me. He would ask me if I needed anything, his voice soft and hesitant, and he would wait, patiently, for my slow, difficult answer. He started to see me again, not as a corpse, but as a mystery, a terrible, powerful mystery that lived in his house. He started spending time with me. He would come into my room in the evenings, and he would just sit there, in the other chair, in silence. He wouldn't look at his phone. He would just sit, and he would listen. He was listening, I think, for the breath. He was listening to the silence, terrified of what it might contain. One evening, after weeks of this strange silent vigil, he finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice a low, broken thing. He was not looking at me. He was staring at his own hands, clasped tightly in his lap. For what I said, for what I did, for everything. I looked at him, at my son, a man hollowed out by his own fear, his own guilt. The cold, hard diamond of my rage, the thing that had sustained me for so long, began to melt. And in its place, I felt a familiar, aching, maternal sorrow. I reached out my hand, my slow, trembling hand, and I placed it on his arm. He flinched at my touch, as if he expected an electric shock. I spoke, my own voice, my physical voice, a rusty, slurred whisper. But the words were clear enough. "I know, Gregory," I said. And he broke. He put his head in his hands and he began to sob, the dry, racking, silent sobs of a man who had not allowed himself to feel anything for a very long time. He wept for his own cruelty, for his lost mother, for the ghost that he had created. Our relationship did not magically heal. A wound that deep leaves a permanent scar. But the war was over. The haunting was done. My breath was my own again. He and Claire divorced a year later. Her husband had become a stranger, a quiet, haunted man who had lost his ambition, his drive, his ruthless edge. He had been broken, and she had no use for a broken man. Gregory did not send me away. I lived out the rest of my days in that silent white house. But it was no longer a prison. It was a home again. A quiet, sad, but peaceful home. Gregory cared for me with a tenderness and a patience he had never possessed before. He learned to listen to my slow words. He learned to see the life in my eyes. He learned to sit with the silence. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would hear him walking the halls. I knew he was listening, still, for the echo of a breath that was no longer there. He had killed his mother with his words, and she, in turn, had brought him back to life with her silence. The lesson in all of this is a strange and terrible one. Life is a stubborn, persistent thing. It is more than a heartbeat, more than a functioning brain. It is a force, an energy, a presence. To deny someone their life, to declare them a corpse while their heart is still beating, is a dangerous and arrogant act. Because life, when it is cornered, when it is threatened, will find a way to make itself heard. It will find a way to breathe. It will find a way to haunt you. Not with chains and whispers from beyond the grave, but with the simple, undeniable, terrifying sound of its own existence. Thank you for sitting with me in the silence and listening to my story. It is a story about the power of breath and the importance of being truly seen. Your presence here, your willingness to listen, is a reminder that we are all alive and that our lives, our stories, have weight and meaning. Please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel for more stories from the heart, and clicking that notification bell so you don't miss our next story. In the comments below, I invite you to simply write the words, "I am here." It is a small act, but a powerful one. A declaration of your own life, your own breath, your own beautiful, undeniable presence in this world. Love you all. This is Grandma Helen, and I'll see you in the next story.